Russia and Ukraine traded drone attacks this Wednesday as Kyiv targeted Moscow again, and Russian President Vladimir Putin's forces launched a bombardment into Ukraine's storage deposits, according to officials, The Hill reports.
This comes just weeks after the United States announced it would be sending another round of billions in aid to the war-torn nation. Joining us now to discuss is Lyle Goldstein, Director of Asia Engagement at Defense Priorities and visiting professor at Brown University. Thanks for joining us, Professor Goldstein.
Glad to be with you.
So we hear a lot in the media of like a back and forth between Russia making advancements, Ukraine making advancements. What do you make of the current state of affairs in Ukraine today?
Mm-hmm. Well, I judge it to be a stalemate. It's been that way for some time. There was some substantial movement on the lines back in last fall, but I think the Ukrainian counteroffensive has more or less, unfortunately, has really felt against these major defenses there in the southern part of Ukraine. So unfortunately, a lot of people, I think, reading the events of last fall, thought these successes, major successes by the Ukrainian army could continue. But unfortunately, they seem to have been completely stymied as far as I can gather.
Professor, you talked about the stalemate here, and this brings me to the way many Americans are viewing this. I want to go to a CNN poll that just came out August 14th that showcases overall 55% of Americans believe the U.S. Congress should not authorize additional funding to support Ukraine, versus 45% who said Congress should, and 51% say that the U.S. has already done enough to help Ukraine, while 48% say that we should do more. When you talk about that stalemate and you look at these numbers and how Americans are slowly starting to change their views and opinions about what many have argued is a proxy war here, where does this end? Is there any end in sight in terms of the United States providing funding and other resources to Ukraine?
Well, I think Americans are being realistic, and I think Americans also want to see peace reestablished. They understand, they're watching the carnage unfold. They see what they are coming around to see as a huge waste of lives and resources. And I think so. We're grappling, steadily, as it were, coming to confront reality, which is that Russia has always had a firepower overmatch here that's difficult, if not and probably impossible to redress. And although, Kyiv has had some stunning successes, including, first and foremost, the defense of their capital, which was incredibly brave. And, they did achieve a great victory there. But unfortunately, the long-term trends are not favorable, and some kind of, compromise. Nobody likes compromise in Washington, but compromise is what it's going to take here to get back to some kind of peace. But no, I'm not surprised that Americans have lost patience, and I fear that unfortunately the current administration seems to have no serious end game here, and I believe they're just confronting military realities, which frankly they should have recognized. You can't send tanks forward without air cover. You just can't. Even before the age of drones, certainly in the age of drones, we should understand that. Similarly, you can't blunder your way through a minefield and hope for the best. It's an extremely arduous operation, and again, requires a massive firepower overmatch that Ukraine simply doesn't have and has no prospect of gaining.
A lot of folks are paying attention to Prigozhin's death. What do you make of that? How does that change the landscape, if at all?
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think it really changes much. Look, anybody who's been watching Russian politics, and that's most of us for the last 20 years, should not be surprised. Of course, we all think that this was an assassination. Look, it shows some weakness in the Russian system for sure. In the main, it betrays the insecurity of the Kremlin regime. However, I would not exaggerate that. I think Russia is kind of has its head down in a kind of wartime mode, which is, rather a familiar one, and one I think which many Russians seem to, how to put it, they like to cultivate that in their national character, as it were, embracing hardship and warfare. That's unfortunate, of course, and many Russians are dying, and Russian national interests have suffered. But in the main, no, I don't see any major changes. I mean, what it does show, I think, is that the Russian leader, unfortunately, is willing to violate conventional norms, across the board, if it includes assassinating his political opponents. But I fear, that this may apply to other things like use of nuclear weapons. So I've long warned that we are up against, that this is a very dangerous situation. President Biden himself said last October that we were closer to the apocalypse, and he was referring to the anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, this is as close as we've been in 60 years. So I took that statement very seriously, and I think others should as well. We seem to be in denial in that respect, but that's another reason why we should favor a negotiated solution in the near term here.
Now, you mentioned the word compromise, and I'm curious to know, for people who are watching this and trying to understand where this comes to an end. You had the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, even the president himself alluded to this idea of Ukraine joining NATO, potentially supporting such a request. That could indeed push Vladimir Putin to consider using a nuclear, biological, or chemical weapon. So in your opinion, Professor, what necessitates compromise here? What does that look like? Because as you just articulated, many Americans want to see an end to this at some point. They don't want a never-ending proxy war.
Mm-hmm. Well, let me clarify. I think the Russians would potentially use a nuclear weapon if they were losing badly. And at various points in this war, it looked like they were losing badly. And I do fear if there was a massive defeat of the Russian armed forces, that they would deploy probably tactical nuclear weapons to save the situation as they perceived it. So I think that is a real danger. But to get to your question more, how do I view compromise? I mean, to me, compromise is realizing that these kind of maximalist aims that have been articulated for a long time now in both Washington and Kyiv are don't hold water. Again, they're kind of meeting crashing against the rocks of reality and have to be readjusted. So inevitably, I think this will result probably in some kind of territorial concessions. On the other hand, though, I've long argued that Ukraine has achieved a great victory. It already has. The Ukrainian state is for sure, and there's nothing Russia can do about it. So they have saved their country. Now it should be rebuilt. And that should be the focus of Ukraine and also Washington and Europe's efforts. But trying to regain all this territory against a power that has firepower overmatch and nuclear weapons to back that up is just, it's completely unrealistic. And the worst thing is it's resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians. And that is a true tragedy. I don't know that Americans fully appreciate just how bad the losses are. I mean, there was an article in the media the other day about how the number of amputees is quite on par with World War I. I mean, think about that, folks. That's, an entire generation of Ukrainians decimated. And how to put it, they may be the lucky ones who have survived.
Me and a lot of those who have this anti-interventionist view would look at the situation between Ukraine and Russia and say, okay, does U.S. intervention make this situation better or worse? A lot of Americans have made similar calculations in their heads, even if they weren't anti-interventionist going into the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But it seems now that that's a pretty popular sentiment, just criticism of billions of dollars of aid going to Ukraine. What do you make of this shifting political view in America of anti-intervention? Do you think it will shape any of our foreign policy or military strategy?
Mm-hmm. Well, I view it as a key component of realism. I mean, unfortunately, U.S. foreign policy and defense policy have long been guided by sort of emotion and, how to put it, sort of the ethics that you get in elementary school. There's good guys and bad guys. treat your friends well. Yes, those are good principles, but it doesn't quite cut it in the real world of geopolitics. And here, realism is required, and often it's the most humane solution. And I and many others have argued that this war could have been prevented by skillful negotiation. And I think many Americans kind of see through the hype and are beginning to realize that by applying restraint and realism, we can get to better solutions. Of course, I myself wonder what could have been done with the $100 billion. And it's a lot more than that, actually. If you look back through 20 years of aid to Ukraine, it's a lot more than that. And then walk that 20 years forward, as we've made quite a bit of, all these commitments. So at least on kind of an emotional level, and in the policy rhetoric. So I'm very concerned, and I think we need to rein it in. And I mean, to me, this, I have to say, I think this fits a pattern of these endless wars, and it's because we don't have an adequate level of realism about what can be achieved, and that other countries, frankly, especially other great powers, have real interests that they're willing to fight for. And, we can use the word core interests, and so when you go about challenging another great power's core interest, well, you can expect that fight to go on and to have major potential for escalation and involve huge losses and involve huge risks. So that's why I and other realists have strongly recommended against these kind of risky policies, and that's exactly what we've done in Ukraine.
Professor, we got to let you go, but I know the control room is going to hate me for this, but I have to get this last question in for our viewers. What benefit do you see to China in all of this, if you quickly could answer that?
Well, I am first and foremost a China expert, although I do speak Russian as well. But it's, look, on the margins, China has benefited to some extent. China's trade with Russia is booming. Frankly, a lot of Americans are getting rich off this war. A lot of Chinese are getting rich off this war. We can say that. But in general, I mean, by the way, China also is very much studying our military tactics. They get to look at how HIMARS is actually deployed in combat. You can bet they're very interested in that, and they'll be asking their Russian friends, for the, all the data on HIMARS and probably getting it too. So yeah, there are benefiting on the margins, but in general, no, I don't think China is benefiting from this. It's making for endless complications. It's definitely hindering some of China's economic projects, and I would say in general, China is quite sincere in wanting this war to end.
Professor Lyle Goldstein, thanks so much for joining us. More Rising after this.